The air over Germany on the 7th of November 1943 was a treacherous gray canvas of fog and freezing rain. For Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the U.S. Army Air Forces, it had become a disorienting prison. Lost, dangerously low on fuel, and separated from his squadron during a chaotic escort mission, his only thought was survival. His aircraft, a massive Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, nicknamed Beetle, was a formidable war machine. But even its powerful Pratt and Whitney engine couldn't run on fumes. Then, through a tear in the clouds, he saw it. A runway. A wave of profound relief washed over him. He had made it. With the practiced skill of a trained fighter pilot, Roach brought the nearly 7-ton behemoth in for a textbook landing. The wheels kissed the tarmac smoothly, and the giant propeller slowed its spin as he taxied the aircraft off the main strip. He had survived the weather, survived the isolation, and now he was safe on what he believed to be a friendly forward operating base. But as he cut the engine and the roar subsided into an eerie silence, the details of his surroundings began to sharpen, and the cold dread that replaced his relief was far more chilling than the winter air. The ground crew approaching him didn't wear the familiar olive drab of the U.S. Army. They wore the stark field gray of the German Wehrmacht. The vehicles weren't American jeeps. They were Kübelwagens, marked with the black cross of the Luftwaffe. The sickening realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't found salvation. He had meticulously delivered one of America's most advanced fighter aircraft directly into the hands of the enemy. He was at Karpik, a German airfield deep within occupied territory. For Lieutenant Roach, his personal war was likely over. But for the German war machine, a new, far more consequential chapter had just begun. For the German officers who rushed to the scene, the sight of the pristine P-47D sitting on their runway was nothing short of miraculous. This wasn't a wreck salvaged from a crash site, riddled with bullet holes and mangled by impact. It was a fully intact, operational specimen. The P-47, which Luftwaffe pilots had nicknamed the Juggernaut, was a fearsome opponent in the skies. They knew it was heavily armed, incredibly durable, and brutally effective as a high-altitude escort fighter. They had fought against it, they had cursed its resilience, but they had never had the chance to truly understand it. Until now. This unexpected gift was immediately recognized for what it was: an intelligence goldmine. The aircraft was carefully secured and prepared for a journey to the heart of the German aviation research and development effort, the legendary Rechlin-Leers airfield, the Luftwaffe's primary testing ground. To the engineers and tacticians of the Third Reich, this captured Thunderbolt seemed to offer a priceless opportunity. It was a chance to dissect their enemy's philosophy, to probe for weaknesses, and to uncover the technological secrets that made American air power so formidable. They believed they were about to learn how to defeat the American juggernaut. They approached the task with a renowned sense of German thoroughness and engineering prowess. This machine, they thought, would reveal its flaws under their expert scrutiny. They would find shortcuts in its construction, compromises in its materials, and vulnerabilities in its design that they could then ruthlessly exploit. The German High Command saw Roach's P-47 as a key that could unlock a decisive advantage in the brutal air war raging over Europe. But this gift from the sky was deceptive. It was a Trojan horse, not of soldiers, but of a shocking and demoralizing truth. The secrets held within its metal skin were far more profound than mere technical specifications. The Beetle was a messenger, carrying a revelation about the sheer scale of American industrial might, and a philosophy of warfare that the resource-starved German state was, perhaps ill-equipped to comprehend, let alone counter. The German engineers thought they were about to discover how to beat a single airplane. They couldn't possibly imagine that they were, in fact, about to confront the terrifying reality of a system that could produce thousands upon thousands of them, a system that valued ruggedness and mass production over the delicate, handcrafted perfection they held so dear. What could be more dangerous than an enemy's weapon? Perhaps it was discovering the unbelievable power of the factory that built it. When the captured P-47 Beetle finally arrived at the Rechlin Test Center. It was met not with fear, but with a palpable sense of professional curiosity and a healthy dose of arrogance. To the elite pilots and engineers of the Luftwaffe, this was their craft, their domain. They were the masters of aerial warfare, the pioneers of blitzkrieg tactics, men who flew aircraft like the Focke-Wulf Ju-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109 planes they regarded as thoroughbreds, designed with a jeweler's precision for speed, agility, and lethality. And then there was this American machine, parked next to the sleek, predatory lines of an FW-190. The P-47 looked almost agricultural. It was enormous, brutish, and seemed to embody a design philosophy of sheer, unsubtle force. The pilots, many of them seasoned veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, circled it with a mixture of amusement and disdain. The jokes came easily. They called it the Juggernaut, not as a compliment to its unstoppable nature, but as a jab at its perceived clumsiness. Others, noting its bulky, barrel-shaped fuselage, mockingly referred to it as a flying bathtub or a water boiler. To their eyes, accustomed to the principle of building the most powerful engine into the smallest possible airframe, the P-47 was a monstrosity. Its weight alone was staggering fully loaded. It tipped the scales at over 14,000 pounds, significantly heavier than their own frontline fighters. In the unforgiving calculus of a low-altitude dogfight, weight was the enemy. Agility was life. By their proven standards, the P-47 was a flying coffin. This initial assessment was more than just battlefield banter. It was a reflection of Germany's entire approach to war. By late 1943, the German war economy was stretched to its breaking point. Every kilogram of steel, every liter of fuel, every gram of precious alloy was meticulously allocated. Their engineering was a triumph of optimization within scarcity. They built brilliant, high-performance machines because they had to. They couldn't afford waste. And looking at the P-47, all they saw was waste. They saw a profligate use of materials, a design that favored brute strength over elegance, and an aircraft that seemed to be built for a nation that had no concept of material limitations. This perception, while accurate in its assessment of American industrial capacity, led them to a dangerously flawed conclusion: that a nation so careless with its resources must also be careless with its engineering. But amidst the chorus of confident dismissal, one man remained silent and observant. He was Hans Werner Lerche, a chief test pilot and graduate engineer for the Luftwaffe. Lerche was not a typical fighter ace driven by instinct and aggression. He was a scientist of the skies, a man who trusted data over dogma and methodical analysis over hangar gossip. While others saw a clumsy giant, Lerche saw a puzzle. He walked around the Thunderbolt, not with the eyes of a pilot, looking for a weakness to exploit in a dogfight, but with the cool, appraising gaze of an engineer examining a rival's work. He noted the fine tolerances of the construction, the quality of the riveting, the sheer size of the air intakes for the complex engine. There was a purpose here, a logic that he felt his colleagues were too quick to dismiss. His skepticism was bolstered by a growing file of unsettling reports from the front lines. Luftwaffe pilots returning from combat over the continent told confusing, often contradictory stories. In level flight or a climb at lower altitudes, they confirmed the P-47 was indeed sluggish. More than one German ace had claimed an easy victory after catching a Thunderbolt pilot in a turning fight below 15,000 feet. But the stories changed dramatically when the combat moved to the higher altitudes. Veteran pilots spoke of the P-47's astonishing dive speed. They reported chasing the American fighters, only to watch in disbelief as the massive planes simply nosed over and accelerated away, plunging at speeds their own WWII seconds and Bf-109 seconds could not hope to match without risking structural failure. Even more unnerving were the reports of the Thunderbolt's incredible toughness. Pilots recounted emptying their cannons into the P-47 seconds, seeing pieces fly off the wings and fuselage, only for the American plane to absorb the punishment and continue flying, often trailing smoke, but steadfastly refusing to fall from the sky. One particularly grim report noted, "We hit it with everything we had. It should have disintegrated. It just flew home." How could a machine that seemed so poorly designed on paper perform such feats? How could this flying bathtub outdive their best interceptors and absorb lethal damage as if it were a minor inconvenience? This was the contradiction that Lerche was determined to solve. The confident dismissals in the halls of Rechlin did not align with the fearful respect the machine was earning among the men who actually had to fight it. The initial German assessment, he suspected, was not just incomplete, it was catastrophically wrong. They were judging the P-47 by the standards of their own tactical reality, a defensive war fought by short-range interceptors over their own territory. But the P-47 wasn't built for that kind of war. It was a long-range strategic escort, designed to fight in the thin, frigid air 6 miles above the Earth, a domain where the rules of aerial combat were entirely different. The Germans were looking at a deep-sea predator and judging it by its ability to walk on land. Lurch knew that anecdotal evidence and pilot bravado were useless. The truth lay within the machine itself, in its engine, its systems, and its aerodynamics. The only way to truly understand this American juggernaut was not to mock it, but to methodically deconstruct it, and more importantly, to fly it. He needed to take it to its own preferred hunting ground, that unforgiving high-altitude arena, and see what it could really do. The initial impression was one of contemptuous superiority, but as Hans Lerche prepared for his first test flight, a quiet, professional unease began to creep in. He had a feeling they were about to learn a lesson they did not want to hear, a lesson that would challenge everything they thought they knew about air superiority. Settling into the cockpit of the P-47 was, for Hans Lerche, an almost alien experience. The German fighters he was accustomed to, the Bf-109 and Fu-190, were built with a philosophy of Spartan efficiency. Their cockpits were tight, claustrophobic spaces, designed to make the pilot feel like an extension of the machine. Every control within immediate, instinctive reach. The Thunderbolt was different. The cockpit was cavernous, the seat comfortable and heavily armored. The instrument panel was a sprawling landscape of gauges, levers, and switches, far more complex than its German counterparts. It felt less like the cockpit of a thoroughbred racing machine and more like the operator's station of a complex piece of industrial equipment. This initial impression seemed to confirm the prevailing theory. It was an over-engineered, needlessly complicated brute. His first few flights did little to challenge that assumption. On takeoff, the P-47 felt ponderous, its massive weight resisting the pull of gravity with a grudging roar. In the thick, dense air below 15,000 feet, it handled exactly as the frontline pilots had described. It was heavy on the ailerons, slow to roll, and its turning circle felt as wide as a barn door. Lerche could easily imagine an agile FW-190 dancing circles around it, pouring cannon fire into its bulky frame. He pushed the aircraft through a series of standard maneuvers, his mind methodically cataloging its deficiencies. At this low altitude, it was, without a doubt, an inferior dogfighter. The dismissive jokes about the flying bathtub seemed entirely justified. For a moment, Lerche may have felt a sense of relief, a confirmation that German engineering principles were indeed superior. But Lerche's mission was not to confirm biases, it was to find the truth. The real test was about to begin. Pushing the throttle forward, he pointed the nose of the Beetle towards the heavens, beginning a steady, methodical climb into the upper atmosphere. The world below shrank away, the patchwork of German fields and forests dissolving into a hazy map. 18,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 22,000 feet. This was the zone where German fighters began to feel the strain. The thin air offered less bite for their propellers and starved their mechanically driven superchargers. A Focke-Wulf 4-190, so dominant at lower altitudes, would start to feel sluggish up here, its engine performance dropping off with every 1,000 feet gained. Lerche, however, felt none of that in the P-47. The massive Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine didn't sound strained. Its roar remained a deep, resonant, and remarkably consistent hum. The controls, which had felt so heavy and unresponsive down below, were beginning to feel lighter, more balanced. Something was happening. A subtle but undeniable shift was taking place in the aircraft's fundamental character. He pushed onward and upward, climbing past 25,000 feet the ceiling, where many fighters started to struggle for their very breath. And then, it happened. It was not a sudden jolt or a dramatic surge, but a smooth, inexorable awakening. The P-47 stopped being a heavy lifter and became a predator. At this altitude, the complex system that the bewildering array of cockpit gauges monitored came into its own. The General Electric Turbo Supercharger, a device that used the engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine and force compressed air into the engine, was now operating in its ideal environment. In the thin, freezing air, it was a miracle of engineering. A mechanical lung that allowed the R-2800 engine to breathe as deeply and powerfully as it did at sea level. The beast had awakened. Lerche leveled off at 30,000 feet and gently nudged the throttle. The response was instantaneous and ferocious. The P-47 surged forward with an acceleration that pinned him to his armored seat. The speed indicator climbed with an eagerness he had never felt at this altitude. He was now flying in the stratosphere, the domain of the high-flying bombers this aircraft was designed to protect. He put the plane into a gentle turn, then tightened it. The sluggishness was gone. The wings bit into the thin air with authority, and the plane responded with a grace that completely belied its size. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who understands the laws of physics and aerodynamics, that no standard Luftwaffe fighter could touch him up here. A Bf-109G would be wallowing, its pilot struggling to keep the wings level. An FW-190A would have reached its practical performance ceiling thousands of feet below. Here, in its chosen element, the P-47 was not just good, it was supreme. It could climb faster, fly faster, and likely outmaneuver any German opponent foolish enough to challenge it in this arena. The juggernaut that was mocked on the ground was, in fact, the undisputed king of the stratosphere. The realization that washed over Lerche was a profound and deeply unsettling cocktail of emotions. As an engineer, he was filled with a sense of awe. This was a magnificent technological achievement. He admired the audacity of the design, the sheer power of the engine, the brilliance of the turbo supercharger system. But as a German patriot, he was filled with a chilling dread. His colleagues had been catastrophically wrong. They had evaluated the enemy on their own terms, in their own backyard, and had completely missed the point. The air war was not being won in turning dogfights at 10,000 feet. It was being decided at 30,000 feet, alongside the bomber streams, where the P-47 reigned supreme. Every dismissive joke, every arrogant assumption, had been a step toward strategic self-deception. As he descended back towards Rechlin, the P-47 once again became heavier, more cumbersome, its magical high-altitude grace fading with every foot of lost altitude. But it no longer mattered. Lerche had seen the truth. He had flown the beast in its natural habitat. The flight had answered the question of what the P-47 could do. Now, a far more critical task remained. He and his team of engineers had to take it apart, screw by screw, wire by wire, and answer the terrifying question of how. The secret to this high-altitude supremacy was hidden somewhere deep within the machine's metallic heart, and he knew, with a sinking feeling, that the answer would be even more sobering than the flight itself. With Hans Lerche's sobering flight report now circulating among the highest echelons of the Luftwaffe, the atmosphere in the hangar at Rechlin shifted from professional curiosity to one of grim urgency. The P-47D Beetle, now drained of its fuel and oil, was no longer an aircraft. It was a specimen, laid out on a sterile operating table, about to be subjected to the most thorough autopsy the Third Reich's finest engineering minds could conduct. The hangar doors were sealed, guards were posted, and a team of specialists, metallurgists, engine experts, aerodynamicists, and armament technicians assembled in the cold, clinical light. The mockery was gone, replaced by the hushed reverence of professionals about to dissect the work of a master, or perhaps a monster. The process began with the outer skin, and the first revelation was one of brute force. The German engineers, accustomed to shaving every possible gram from their designs, were astounded by the sheer amount of armor plating. It wasn't just a token steel plate behind the pilot's seat. It was a carefully integrated system of protection. A massive slab of armor protected the pilot's back and head. The oil coolers and critical engine components were shielded. The windscreen was made of thick, multi-layered bullet-resistant glass. The American design philosophy was immediately starkly apparent. An aircraft was replaceable, but a trained, experienced pilot was a precious national asset. In Germany, where pilots were often thrown into combat with minimal training late in the war, this level of protection seemed like an almost unbelievable luxury. As they peeled back the aluminum skin panels, the second shock came. It was the quality and consistency of the materials. Germany's own industry was suffering from critical shortages of high-grade alloys. They were forced to make do with what they had, leading to variations in quality and a reliance on complex, labor-intensive craftsmanship to compensate for material deficiencies. The P-47 showed no such compromises. The aluminum alloys were of the highest grade, consistent from nose to tail. The forgings for the wing spars were massive and flawlessly executed. Most astonishingly, every component, from the smallest rivet to the largest structural beam, was standardized and perfectly interchangeable. A German engineer could spend a full day carefully hand-filing a replacement part to fit a specific FW-190. The Americans, it seemed, could simply pull a new wing out of a crate, bolt it on, and send the plane back into the fight. This was not craftsmanship, as the Germans understood it. This was something else, entirely. Something that spoke of a different world. This was the brutal, undeniable power of mass production raised to the level of an art form. It was a direct reflection of a conflict between two fundamentally different engineering philosophies. The German approach was that of a master artisan, meticulously crafting a small number of exquisite, high-performance weapons. It was a philosophy born of necessity and pride, optimizing for performance above all else, because they knew they could never compete on numbers. The American philosophy, as embodied by this Thunderbolt, was that of an industrial titan. It was a philosophy that said, "We will build so many, so well, and so easily repairable, that your exquisite handful of weapons will be ground into dust by the sheer, unending avalanche of our production." For the engineers at Rechlin, this was a deeply personal confrontation. They were men who prided themselves on their ingenuity, on their ability to create brilliance out of scarcity. And yet, here was evidence of an enemy who didn't need to be clever with resources, because their resources were seemingly infinite. As they examined the neatly bundled, color-coded wiring looms, designed for quick and easy troubleshooting, they might have thought of their own complex, tightly packed systems that were a nightmare for field mechanics. When they saw the rugged, almost agricultural simplicity of the landing gear, built to withstand the abuse of primitive forward airfields, they likely felt a pang of what could only be described as professional envy. They were looking at a machine designed not just to win a single dogfight, but to win a long, grinding war of attrition. This realization began to sow a seed of doubt that went far beyond technical specifications. It was a confrontation with a different mindset. They were fighting a war of tactical brilliance and operational excellence. The Americans, it seemed, were fighting a war of logistics, production, and overwhelming material superiority. The German engineers were asking, "How can we make a better fighter?" The P-47 seemed to answer with a different question entirely. How can we put 10,000 good enough fighters over enemy territory, keep them flying, and overwhelm him with our presence? And then they came to the heart of the machine. The wings and fuselage had been largely disassembled, the intricate systems of wiring and hydraulics laid bare for analysis. Now, sitting on a massive engine stand in the center of the hangar, was the source of the P-47's incredible high-altitude power. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp. It was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine, a monster of engineering that was, even on its own, a masterpiece of industrial production. But the German engineers knew the engine itself was only half the story. Their eyes were drawn to the complex web of pipes and ducting that snaked away from the engine towards the rear of the fuselage. This was the circulatory system for the mechanical lung that gave the beast its breath in the stratosphere. They had seen its effect in the air. Now they had to confront its source on the ground. As they prepared to dissect the turbo supercharger system, the feeling in the hangar was no longer just respect. It was a quiet, creeping sense of dread. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine was an impressive piece of machinery, but it was a technology the German engineers understood. They had their own powerful radial engines, like the BMW 801 that powered the FW190. While they admired the R-2800's robust construction and quality of manufacturing, it did not represent an insurmountable technological leap. It was the intricate system attached to it that held their complete, undivided, and increasingly anxious attention. The General Electric Type B two-turbo supercharger was not just a component, it was the heart of the P-47's secret identity. In principle, the concept was simple and well known to German engineers. A conventional, engine-driven supercharger uses the engine's own power to run a compressor, forcing more air into the cylinders to produce more power. However, as an aircraft climbs, the air gets thinner, and the engine has to work harder to compress it, leading to a significant drop in performance. A turbo supercharger was the elegant solution. It used the energy of the engine's hot exhaust gases energy that was otherwise completely wasted to spin a turbine. This turbine, in turn, drove a centrifugal compressor that could cram air into the engine at incredibly high pressures, effectively making the engine believe it was still operating at sea level or even below it. This allowed the engine to produce its full rated power at altitudes where its rivals were gasping for breath. The Germans not only understood this principle, they had their own advanced turbo supercharger programs. But their efforts were largely confined to experimental high-altitude reconnaissance planes and prototypes. They had never managed to solve the immense technical challenges required to mass-produce such a device for a frontline fighter. And as they began to carefully disassemble the P-47 system, they finally understood why. The problem wasn't one of intellect. It was one of material science and industrial capability. The core of the challenge lay in the turbine wheel itself. This component had to withstand temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while spinning at an astonishing 20,000 revolutions per minute. To survive such an inferno of heat and stress required exotic high-nickel alloys that could maintain their structural integrity under conditions that would turn ordinary steel into molten slag. The turbine blades, meticulously crafted and perfectly balanced, were made from alloys that the German engineers could only identify from textbooks and research papers. Their own nation's war machine, starved of critical resources like nickel and chromium by Allied bombing and naval blockades, simply did not have these materials in the quantities needed to equip thousands of fighters. They were forced to use lower-grade ersatz materials, which inevitably failed under the extreme conditions. The American solution, laid bare before them, was a testament to a nation that had access to the world's resources. The metallurgy was a work of art, but it was an art made possible by an abundance they could no longer imagine. The German engineers looked at these turbine blades with a profound sense of professional despair. They could analyze them. They could understand their composition. They could even admire the genius of their design. But they could not copy them. To replicate this single component on a mass scale would require a complete re-engineering of Germany's entire high-temperature materials supply chain, a chain that was already collapsing. It was more than just the exotic metals. The entire system was a marvel of industrial precision. The intricate ducting that carried the searing hot exhaust gases, the complex intercoolers that cooled the compressed air before it entered the engine, the automatic regulators that prevented the system from overboosting and destroying itself. Every part was manufactured to exacting standards and designed for reliability. This wasn't a fragile, hand-built laboratory prototype. This was a rugged, mass-produced system designed to be maintained by two zero-year-old mechanics on windswept airfields in England. This was the moment the true crushing weight of their predicament settled upon the team at Rechlin. The flight tests had shown them what the P-47 could do. This teardown showed them why. And the reason was far more demoralizing than a simple performance gap. Their enemy hadn't just built a better component. They had mastered an entire industrial ecosystem that was completely out of Germany's reach. The P-47's high-altitude superiority wasn't a secret weapon in the traditional sense. The secret was the American factory, the American mine, the American supply line. It was a victory forged in the steel mills of Pittsburgh and the research labs of General Electric long before a single shot was fired in the stratosphere. The engineers completed their meticulous drawings, compiled their data, and wrote their reports. They could now explain, in precise technical detail, why their pilots were being outclassed above 25,000 feet. But their newfound knowledge was a bitter pill. It was the clarity of a diagnosis for a terminal illness. They understood the disease perfectly, but they had no cure. The information was strategically priceless and at the same time completely useless. Germany lacked the time, the resources, and the industrial base to counter this technological advantage. They had successfully reverse-engineered a single component, only to realize they would have to reverse-engineer an entire industrial superpower to truly compete. The P-47 Beetle sat in the hangar, now a collection of carefully labeled parts. Its greatest secret had been revealed, not as a clever gadget, but as a simple, brutal fact of material wealth and productive power. The German engineers had unraveled the mystery, but the truth offered no comfort. As they contemplated the perfectly machined turbine blades, they were looking at the physical embodiment of their nation's impending defeat. They had understood the enemy's machine, but what about the men who flew them? Another P-47 had recently fallen into their hands, and the story of its pilot would add a completely different, and perhaps even more complex, layer to their understanding of the nation they were fighting. The dissection of the P-47 Beetle had provided the German High Command with a chilling blueprint of American industrial power. But war is not waged by machines alone. It is waged by the men who operate them. In May 1944, 6 months after Lieutenant Roach's fateful landing, another P-47 Thunderbolt fell into German hands. This time, the aircraft was damaged, but the pilot was captured unharmed. He was brought in for interrogation, and the Germans expected to find another man, much like Roach, a confident, well-fed, and typical product of Middle America. What they found instead presented them with a puzzle of a completely different nature, one that was perhaps even more confounding than the secrets of the turbo supercharger. The pilot's name was Second Lieutenant Lloyd S. Hathcock. He was an American officer, trained to fly one of the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. He was also an African American. For the interrogators, steeped in the Nazi Party's toxic ideology of Aryan racial supremacy, the very existence of a man like Hathcock was a profound contradiction. Their entire worldview was built on a fanatical belief in a rigid racial hierarchy, with people of African descent placed near the very bottom. Yet here, before them, was a member of that very group, an elite aviator entrusted by the enemy with a machine of immense value and power. It was a social and ideological anomaly that their dogma could not easily explain. This encounter forced the more thoughtful members of the German intelligence community to look beyond the rivets and wiring of the Thunderbolt and consider the nature of the society that had produced it. America, they began to realize, was a far more complex and paradoxical beast than their propaganda had led them to believe. They were aware, of course, of America's racial tensions and segregation. They knew that the US military was largely a segregated institution. The existence of the Tuskegee Airmen, the famous all-black fighter group to which Hathcock belonged, was not a secret. But to see it embodied in a single captured pilot made the contradiction starkly real. Here was a nation capable of achieving the pinnacle of industrial rationalization, producing standardized, high-quality machines on a scale that beggared belief. Yet, That same nation was still grappling with deep-seated social irrationality in the form of racial prejudice. It was a nation that could design an engine to conquer the stratosphere, but still judged men based on the color of their skin. For the Germans, this was a potential weakness, a sign of internal division and hypocrisy. But it was also a sign of a strange and unpredictable strength. Hathcock's story adds a vital human layer to the cold, technical analysis of the P-47. His fight was not just against the Luftwaffe. He was, in a very real sense, fighting a war on two fronts. One front was in the skies over Europe, against a foreign enemy. The other was on the ground, against the prejudice that existed within his own country, and sometimes even his own military. For him and his fellow Tuskegee airmen, every mission was more than just a combat sortie. It was a demonstration of their worth, a forceful argument for their right to be considered equal citizens. Their courage was not just about facing enemy fire. It was about overcoming the low expectations and systemic barriers placed before them back home. When Hathcock was eventually sent to Stalag Luft 3, the infamous prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen, he entered another complex social landscape. He was the sole black face in a sea of thousands of white American and Allied officers. In that confined, stressful environment, the racial dynamics of the outside world did not simply disappear. Yet, the shared experience of being a captured airman, of facing the same German captors, and of enduring the same hardships, created a new context. While prejudice certainly didn't vanish, the commonality of their situation often transcended it. An American pilot was an American pilot. They were all in it together. This experience, shared by Hathcock and his fellow prisoners, demonstrated a certain pragmatism and an ability to adapt that was also characteristically American. For the German analysts, this social dimension was a wild card. How do you measure the combat effectiveness of a nation that fights for ideals of freedom that it doesn't fully apply to its own people? How could a society so internally conflicted produce such a unified and overwhelming war effort? The P-47 was a product of a system that could harness immense resources. Lloyd Hathcock was a product of a system that, despite its profound flaws, could still draw upon a vast and diverse pool of human talent, motivated by a complex mixture of patriotism, personal pride, and a burning desire to prove the doubters wrong. The lesson was subtle but powerful. The German engineers had marveled at America's ability to overcome material limitations. Hathcock's story revealed America's messy, imperfect, but ultimately resilient ability to begin overcoming its own social limitations. The Nazi system, rigid and ideologically pure, was brittle. It could not bend without breaking. The American system, by contrast, was chaotic, contradictory, and full of internal tensions. But it was also flexible. It could adapt, it could incorporate dissent, and it could, however slowly and painfully, change. The captured P-47 Beetle taught the Germans about the power of the American factory. The captured pilot, Lieutenant Lloyd Hathcock, taught them a far more difficult lesson about the confounding power of the American spirit. A spirit forged not in a crucible of ideological purity, but in a messy, ongoing experiment in democracy. They had taken the machine apart and understood its mechanics. But as they looked at the pilot, they must have wondered if they could ever truly understand the heart of the nation that had sent both to war. As the autumn of 1944 bled into a harsh winter, the final reports from the Rechlin Test Center began to circulate through the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Third Reich. Compiled by Hans Werner Lerche and his team, the documents were masterpieces of German engineering analysis. They were meticulous, precise, and brutally honest. Every aspect of the P-47D Thunderbolt, from its aerodynamic performance to the metallurgical composition of its turbine blades, was laid out in exhaustive detail. For the German High Command, reading these reports was like listening to a physician calmly and dispassionately describe the mechanics of an incurable disease. The diagnosis was in, and it was fatal. The reports confirmed what Lerche had discovered in the skies. The P-47 was, without question, the superior fighting machine in the high-altitude environment where the strategic air war was being decided. The documents were filled with performance charts and comparison graphs that all told the same grim story. Above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt could outclimb, outrun, and outdive both the FOR-190 and the BF-109. The technical analysis of the turbo supercharger system was a study in professional admiration and despair, concluding that replicating its performance on a mass scale was, given the state of Germany's resources, a practical impossibility. The knowledge they had gained from capturing Lieutenant Roach's Beetle was a strategic dead end. It illuminated the path their enemy had taken to achieve air superiority, but it was a path they could not follow. But the most devastating part of the report was not in the technical analysis. It was in the final section, a cold, hard appendix compiled by the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch. This section moved beyond the performance of a single aircraft and addressed the terrifying industrial reality behind it. It was here that the true climax of the story was reached. Not in a fiery explosion over the skies of Berlin, but in the quiet rustle of paper in an office, where numbers on a page painted a picture of inevitable defeat far more vividly than any combat report ever could. The numbers were staggering, almost nonsensical. The analysts reported, with a tone of disbelief, that the Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, New York, was a single entity dedicated to P-47 production. At its peak, this one factory was rolling out hundreds of these complex fighters every month. But that was just the beginning. To meet demand, the U.S. government had authorized the construction of a second massive plant in Evansville, Indiana, for the sole purpose of building even more Thunderbolts. By the end of the war, these two factories would produce a combined total of 15,683 P-47 seconds. For the German officials reading this, the figure was an abstraction of defeat. Their entire production of the formidable FOR-190 across all variants and all factories for the entire duration of the war was just over 20,000 units. The Americans had nearly matched that total with just one model of aircraft, from just two dedicated plants. The P-47 was not an elite, handcrafted weapon. It was an industrial commodity, produced on a scale more akin to automobiles than to fighter planes. Every German pilot who shot down a Thunderbolt could be grimly certain that 5 more were already on their way across the Atlantic to take its place. Then came the statistic that likely sealed the sense of utter hopelessness. It concerned the P-47's heart, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine. The report noted that the American industrial base had manufactured more than 125,000 of these engines. This single-engine model, used in the P-47, the F-4U Corsair, the F-6F Hellcat, and several medium bombers, had been produced in greater numbers than Germany's entire combined output of its primary fighter engines, the DB600 series for the BF-109, and the BMW 801 for the FW-190 throughout the whole war. This was the final, crushing revelation. This was the truth that the captured Beetle had been sent to deliver. Germany's war was being fought by brilliant engineers and courageous pilots, but they were being systematically overwhelmed by an enemy that had turned warfare into a problem of industrial logistics. The conflict had ceased to be a duel between knights on aerial steeds. It had become a war between a master craftsman and a colossal, tireless, automated factory. The factory was winning. The tension that had built since Lieutenant Roach's landing, the mystery of the P-47's performance, the secrets of its technology, was now released, not in a moment of triumph or breakthrough, but in a quiet, soul-crushing wave of mathematical certainty. There was no clever technical solution, no secret weapon they could design that would reverse this industrial imbalance. They could innovate, they could design jets, like the Me-262, but these were drops in an ocean of allied material strength. The knowledge gained from the P-47 was, in the end, profoundly useless. It provided the precise dimensions of their own coffin. This stark, numerical reality had a devastating psychological impact on the German war effort. For the engineers at Rechlin, it was a validation of their skills, but an invalidation of their entire national strategy. For the pilots on the front line, it confirmed what they were seeing with their own eyes every day. An endless sky, filled with enemy planes, a tide that never seemed to ebb. The sense of fighting against an implacable, unstoppable force was now backed by official data. The war from this point forward was not about winning. It was about managing the inevitable decline. The reports were filed away. The recommendations were noted and largely ignored, as there was little that could be done. The industrial might of the United States, once fully awakened, was a force of nature that no amount of tactical genius could overcome. The story of the captured P-47 was now complete, but the fates of the men and the machines involved had yet to play out, a final postscript to a lesson learned far too late. The story of the captured P-47 does not end with a final, decisive battle, but fades away with the whimper of a collapsing regime. The Beetle, Lieutenant Roach's pristine Thunderbolt, was eventually destroyed. After being thoroughly analyzed at Rechlin, it was transferred to a Luftwaffe demonstration squadron, where it was flown for propaganda and training purposes. In a fittingly ironic end, it was ultimately obliterated on the ground by the very force it represented, an Allied bombing raid that targeted the airfield where it was parked. The machine that had served as a harbinger of American industrial might was consumed by it. The fates of the pilots were, thankfully, far brighter, and in their own ways embodied the complex narrative of America's victory. Lieutenant William E. Roach, the man who inadvertently started this entire technical inquest, survived his captivity. He endured the hardships of a German POW camp and was eventually liberated by Allied forces as the war drew to a close. He returned home to the United States, a free man who had done his duty and had the misfortune of making a single, understandable navigational error with profound consequences. Lieutenant Lloyd S. Hathcock's story continued to break barriers. After his liberation from Stalag Luft III, he, along with his fellow Tuskegee airmen, returned to a nation that was not yet ready to grant them the full equality they had fought for. Yet, their incredible combat record and the undeniable proof of their skill and patriotism became a powerful catalyst in the long struggle for civil rights. Their performance, alongside the service of millions of other minority soldiers, helped pave the way for President Truman's executive order to desegregate the armed forces in 1948. Hathcock's personal war against prejudice did not end when the war in Europe did, but he and his comrades had won a decisive battle. The core lesson from this incredible episode remains as potent today as it was in 1944. The meticulous German analysis of the P-47 Thunderbolt stands as one of history's great testaments to a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Courage is essential and genius is invaluable, but they cannot, by themselves, defeat the relentless logic of industrial scale. The German engineers were brilliant. Their pilots were brave, often fighting against staggering odds, but they were ultimately defeated by a nation that had harnessed its immense natural resources, its innovative spirit, and its diverse population to create a war machine of unprecedented size and efficiency. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the sharp armored tip of a very, very large industrial spear. This story forces us to look beyond the battlefield and into the factories, the mines, and the laboratories that truly determine the outcome of global conflicts. It highlights the critical importance of supply chains, manufacturing capacity, and the ability to sustain a prolonged, high-intensity effort. Germany's war effort was a dazzling but fragile sprint. America's was a marathon, paced and powered by an economic engine the world had never seen. And that brings us to the present day. The lessons of the P-47 reverberate in our modern world, though the nature of industrial power has evolved. The assembly lines that once churned out Thunderbolts have been replaced by clean rooms fabricating microchips and server farms processing vast amounts of data. The brute force of steel and aluminum has been supplemented, and in some cases supplanted, by the invisible power of software, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare. The industrial war of the 20th century has morphed into the technological and information war of the 21st. The fundamental question, however, remains the same. Who possesses the industrial and technological base to sustain their will in a global conflict? The story of the P-47 and the German engineers is a powerful historical lesson about the overwhelming force of industrial production. It proved that in the crucible of total war, the nation with the deepest reserves of material and manufacturing power held the ultimate trump card. But what about today? In a world where conflicts are increasingly fought with drones, satellites, and keystrokes, does the sheer scale of industrial output still reign supreme? Have other factors, like technological agility or information dominance, become more decisive? We want to hear what you think. Share your perspective in the comments below. Do you believe that the lessons learned by the engineers at Redefined still apply? Or has the nature of power shifted so dramatically that a new set of rules now governs the world? Let us know your thoughts, and thank you for joining us on this journey into one of World War II's most revealing technical encounters.